The plea that shook a man's soul. The golden morning sun painted streaks of amber and crimson across the stained-glass windows of St. Mark's Orphanage, casting a kaleidoscope of color onto the worn wooden floors. The air smelled of freshly baked bread from the orphanage's modest kitchen, mixed with the scent of old books and dust, memories of the many children who had walked these halls. Reverend Samuel Hayes stepped through the large double doors, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stone floor. His breath formed a faint mist in the crisp autumn air, and he paused for a moment, adjusting the silver cross hanging around his neck. This place had always been a refuge for the lost, forgotten souls seeking shelter from the storms of life. He had visited countless times over the years, bringing words of faith and hope to the children who had no families to call their own. He had preached in grand churches before politicians and businessmen, but somehow, his heart always felt more at home within these humble walls. Yet today, as he entered the orphanage, something felt different. A strange unease settled in his chest, as though he were standing on the precipice of something he couldn't yet comprehend. Reverend Hayes, a warm voice greeted him. He turned to see Sister Abigail, the orphanage's longtime caretaker. Her face, though aged, still carried a kindness that could calm even the most restless child. She wiped her hands on her apron before clasping his hand in both of hers. "The children are in the playroom," she said with a smile. "They always look forward to your visits." He nodded, offering a polite smile. "And I always look forward to seeing them." As he walked through the narrow halls, laughter and chatter filled the air. He could hear the sounds of tiny feet pattering against the floor, the playful shouts of children lost in games of make-believe. It was the same scene he had witnessed 100 times before. But this time, something, or someone, was waiting for him. He felt it before he saw her. A presence. A pull. As he stepped into the playroom, a hush fell over the children, their attention momentarily diverted by his arrival. Some of them ran toward him, eager to greet him, but his eyes were drawn to one child standing in the corner, watching him intently. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, with deep brown eyes that seemed far too knowing for her age. She was small and thin, her curly hair tied into 2 neat braids. She wore a faded blue dress that was slightly too big for her, the sleeves rolled up to fit her tiny arms. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. Before he could process the thought, the girl suddenly ran toward him, her small feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor. Without hesitation, she reached out and grabbed his hand. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please adopt me." Silence fell over the room. Samuel froze, his mind unable to catch up with what had just happened. He had been approached by children before, many had clung to his robes, hoping for a kind word or a gentle embrace. But this was different. This was desperate. The little girl's fingers tightened around his. "Please," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anyone. But I know you." Samuel's heart pounded. You know me?" he asked, his voice barely steady. The girl nodded, her wide eyes never leaving his face. "Mommy had a picture of you." A shiver ran down his spine. "My picture?" She nodded again, biting her lower lip. "Mommy said, she used to know you a long time ago." The world tilted beneath his feet. His breath came out in shallow bursts, his mind racing, grasping at fragments of memories he had long buried. A picture. Her mother knew him. And suddenly, it hit him like a freight train. He looked at the girl again, really looked at her this time. The curve of her jaw, the arch of her brows, the shape of her nose. It was unmistakable. He had seen those eyes before. He had seen that face before. Not in the mirror. Not in a dream. But in the face of a young woman who had once stood before him, tears streaming down her cheeks, begging for his understanding. The daughter he had turned away. The child he had abandoned. A hollow, aching pain bloomed in his chest, threatening to consume him. His fingers trembled as he cupped the little girl's face, his voice breaking. "What's your name?" he whispered. She blinked up at him, her lips quivering. "Samantha," she said. "Samantha Hayes." Samuel felt the room blur around him. Hayes. His last name. His daughter's daughter. His granddaughter. The air felt too thick to breathe, the walls closing in. Samantha stared at him with hopeful eyes, unaware of the storm raging inside him. "Please," she said again, her voice small. "I just want a family." Tears burned behind his eyes. Because the last time he had heard those words, it was from her mother, the daughter he had cast aside. And now, standing before him, was the only piece of her left in this world. Begging for a home. Begging for him. But did he deserve it? Could he ever be forgiven? Sister Abigail, who had been silent until now, gently placed a hand on his arm. "Reverend," she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. "Let's step into my office. You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, he had. As he followed Sister Abigail into a quiet room, Samantha's small hand still clinging to his, Samuel realized one terrifying truth. This was not just a visit. This was a reckoning. And the past he had tried to outrun had finally caught up with him, the ghosts of yesterday. The door to Sister Abigail's office creaked as it swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The scent of old parchment and burning wood from the fireplace filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of lavender, her signature fragrance. Samuel stepped inside, his knees feeling unsteady beneath him. His hand was still wrapped around Samantha's tiny fingers, though he barely felt them. He was numb. As the door shut behind them, silence settled in. Sister Abigail gestured toward the worn leather armchair near her desk. "Please, Reverend. Sit." Samuel hesitated before finally lowering himself into the chair, feeling as if the weight of his past had suddenly grown too heavy to bear. Samantha stood beside him, her big brown eyes watching him carefully, as if trying to gauge his emotions. She still didn't know. She had no idea that the man sitting in front of her, the one she was begging to take her home, was the very same man who had abandoned her mother years ago. And now, there was nothing left of her mother. Only this child. Only his granddaughter. Sister Abigail cleared her throat, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. She folded her hands in front of her, her expression unreadable. "Samuel," she said gently, "I take it, you recognize her?" His throat tightened. He could lie. Pretend he saw nothing familiar in the girl's face. Pretend he wasn't being ripped apart from the inside. But what good would that do? His hands clenched into fists on his lap. "She's my daughter's child," he admitted, his voice hoarse. Samantha tilted her head. "You knew my mommy?" The innocence in her voice was a knife to his chest. "Knew her? I broke her. I sent her away. I left her to suffer alone." Samuel swallowed hard and forced a nod. "Yes," he whispered. "I knew her." Samantha's face lit up with excitement. "Did you love her?" The question crushed the air from his lungs. His fingers dug into the leather armrests of the chair as memories rushed back, memories of Lillian standing at his doorstep, tears streaming down her cheeks, pleading with him to listen. "Daddy, please. I have nowhere else to go." But he had closed his heart. Closed the door. "You made your bed, Lillian," he had told her coldly. "Now lie in it." And now, she was gone. Samuel's hands trembled as he tried to find words, but all that escaped was a strangled breath. Sister Abigail must have sensed his struggle, because she turned to Samantha and knelt down in front of her. "Sweetheart, would you like to get some hot cocoa from the kitchen while I talk to Reverend Hayes for a moment?" Samantha hesitated, her gaze flicking between them. She was sharp, too sharp for a child her age. But after a moment, she nodded. Okay. As she skipped out of the room, Samuel finally let out the breath he had been holding. His fingers rubbed over his temples, his entire body weighed down by guilt. Sister Abigail sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. She doesn't know, does she? He shook his head. No. The older woman sighed. Samuel, why did you turn Lillian away? A fresh wave of shame rolled over him. It was, he exhaled sharply. She came to me, pregnant and unmarried. I was a preacher. A man of faith. My congregation looked up to me. I thought I was doing the right thing. I told her she had shamed the family. Sister Abigail's eyes darkened. And so you abandoned her? The words cut deep, because they were true. Yes, he admitted. I abandoned her. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I thought I was standing on righteous ground. I thought I was being strong in my faith. But now, his voice cracked. Now I see that I was just a coward. Sister Abigail leaned forward, her eyes gentle but firm. Samuel, what happened to Lillian? His breath hitched. He didn't want to say it. Because saying it made it real. She's dead, he whispered. Lillian is gone. Sister Abigail closed her eyes, as if she had expected the answer but still wished she were wrong. And Samantha? She asked. What has she been told? Samuel shook his head. I don't know. I don't even know who raised her after Lillian. He swallowed thickly. I don't know anything about her life. Sister Abigail studied him carefully. But she knows you. Samuel let out a hollow laugh. She thinks she does. She thinks I'm a good man. A stranger she can trust. If she knew the truth, if she knew what I did to her mother, he exhaled sharply. She'd never forgive me. Silence stretched between them. After a moment, Sister Abigail spoke. Do you believe in redemption, Reverend? His head snapped up. What? She met his gaze, unwavering. You preach about it every Sunday. You tell your congregation that no sin is too great for God's forgiveness. That even the most broken souls can find healing. She tilted her head. Do you believe that? He looked away. Did he? He had spent his entire life teaching others about grace. And yet, now that he was the one in need of it, he wasn't sure if he deserved it. I don't know if I can be forgiven, he admitted. Sister Abigail smiled sadly. Maybe not by yourself. But Samantha, she is a child. She still has love in her heart. And maybe, just maybe, she's giving you a second chance you don't think you deserve. Samuel's eyes burned. A second chance. Could he even dare to take it? Could he open his heart to this child, the only piece of his daughter left in this world, and truly give her the home she so desperately needed? Or was he doomed to repeat the same mistake all over again? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Samantha peeked in, holding a steaming mug of hot cocoa in her tiny hands. She gave him a bright smile, completely unaware of the war raging in his soul. I got you some too, she said, holding out another cup toward him. Sister Abigail said you might need it. Samuel stared at her. The little girl he had unknowingly cast aside before she was even born. His own flesh and blood. She was giving him a chance. A chance to be better. A chance to do what he had failed to do for her mother. Slowly, his hands stopped shaking as he reached out and took the mug from her. The warmth seeped into his fingers, spreading through his chest. And for the first time in a long, long time, Samuel let himself feel hope. A past that won't stay buried. The warmth of the hot cocoa seeped into Samuel's hands, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. Samantha sat on a cushioned stool beside him, swinging her little legs back and forth, completely unaware of the guilt eating him alive. She had no idea that the man she had latched onto, the man she wanted to take her home, was the very same man who had turned his back on her mother. The weight of that truth pressed against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. Sister Abigail studied him closely, her sharp eyes seeing far too much. "Samuel," she said softly, "this child has been through so much. She doesn't need to lose anyone else." His jaw tightened. "I don't know if I'm the right person to take her." Samantha's head snapped up. Her smile faltered. "But, you said you'd help," she said, her voice small. Samuel's heart clenched. "I did," he admitted. "And I meant it. But adopting a child, taking care of her forever, it's a big responsibility." Samantha set her cocoa down on the table with a thump. "I don't care," she said, folding her little arms. "I want to go with you." Her boldness startled him. Sister Abigail gave a quiet chuckle. "She's a determined one, isn't she?" Samuel exhaled, running a hand down his face. I don't know how to be a father. I failed her mother. What if I fail her too?" The older woman's expression softened. "You weren't ready before. But maybe, just maybe, this is God's way of giving you a second chance." Samuel swallowed hard. A second chance. The words echoed in his mind, stirring something deep in his chest. But before he could say anything, a sharp knock echoed through the orphanage halls. Bang! 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 Sister Abigail frowned. Now who could that be? She rose to her feet and moved toward the door. Samuel turned his gaze back to Samantha, who was now watching him intently. "Are you gonna leave me too?" she asked suddenly. The question hit him like a punch to the gut. His voice caught. Before he could respond, the door swung open. And the past he had tried so hard to bury walked in. The man in the gray coat. A man stood in the doorway, dressed in a heavy gray coat that was dusted with the remnants of a recent rain. His face was gaunt, his expression unreadable. But Samuel knew him. Even after all these years, he knew him. The man's piercing blue eyes swept across the room before landing on Samuel. And then, slowly, he smirked. Well, he drawled. "Look who it is." Samuel stiffened. "Sister Abigail," the man continued, stepping inside and shaking off his coat. "I apologize for the sudden visit, but I believe you have something that belongs to me." Sister Abigail frowned. "And who might you be, sir?" The man turned toward Samantha. "I'm her grandfather." The room froze. Samuel's breath hitched. Samantha's other grandfather. Sister Abigail's eyes narrowed. Lillian never spoke of her father-in-law. The man chuckled. "That's because she wanted nothing to do with me." His gaze flicked to Samuel. Just like she wanted nothing to do with him. Samuel's blood ran cold. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as old memories resurfaced, memories of the man who had shattered Lillian's life before Samuel ever had the chance. "You don't deserve to be here," Samuel said, his voice low. The man smirked. "Neither do you, Reverend." Samantha looked between them, confusion flickering across her face. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. Sister Abigail's posture stiffened, and she gently pulled Samantha closer. "Mr. Russell," she said carefully, "why are you here?" Russell, Gregory Russell. A name Samuel had hoped to never hear again. Gregory exhaled slowly, placing his hands in his coat pockets. Simple. "Samantha is my son's child, and by law, she belongs with me." Samuel's breath caught. "No," he said instantly. You're not taking her. Gregory raised a brow. Oh. And who's going to stop me? You? He laughed. You abandoned her mother. You have no right to pretend you care now. The words stung. Because they were true. Samuel had pushed Lillian away. But this man? Gregory Russell had been a monster. Samantha looked up at him, her brows furrowed. You're my grandpa? She asked. Gregory's face softened, a calculated move. That's right, sweetheart. And I've been looking for you for a long time. Samuel stood up. No, you haven't, he said darkly. You didn't care when she was born. You didn't care when Lillian was suffering. And now, suddenly, you want to take her? Gregory's smirk widened. And why do you care, Reverend? She's not your responsibility. Samantha gripped Samuel's hand. His chest tightened. Gregory's expression darkened. She's my blood. Samuel clenched his jaw. She's Lillian's daughter. And I'll be damned if I let you ruin her life the way you ruined hers. Gregory let out a low chuckle. Big words, Reverend. But the law doesn't care about your guilt. He turned to Sister Abigail. Tell me, does this orphanage have the proper paperwork to keep her? No legal guardian, no will, no next of kin? Sister Abigail remained silent. Gregory's smirk returned. That's what I thought. He turned back to Samuel. You want to play hero? Fine. But if you stand in my way, you'd better be ready for a fight. He adjusted his coat and took a step toward the door. I'll be back, he promised. And next time, I won't be asking. And with that, he was gone. The decision that would change everything. The moment the door closed, Samantha turned to Samuel. You won't let him take me, will you? Samuel's breath hitched. The fear in her voice. The trust in her eyes. She believed in him. She wanted him. And for the first time in his life, he knew what he had to do. He turned to Sister Abigail. What do I need to do to adopt her? The older woman's eyes softened. Are you sure? Samuel looked down at Samantha, the little girl who had just walked into his life but had already changed everything. He thought of Lillian. Of all the regrets. Of all the mistakes. And then, with newfound certainty, he nodded. Yes, he said. I won't fail her too. The battle for Samantha. The moment the door slammed shut, an eerie silence filled the room. Samuel's hands trembled as he gripped the arms of his chair. His heart pounded, his pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt fear. Not for himself. But for her. Samantha clung to his sleeve, her little fingers tightening around the fabric. You won't let him take me, right? Samuel looked down at her, and something inside him shifted. He had spent years running from his past, drowning in regret, convinced he had lost his chance to make things right. But now, sitting beside this little girl with Lillian's eyes, he realized something. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about her future. And he'd be damned if he let Gregory Russell destroy it. He turned to Sister Abigail. What do I need to do to adopt her? The nun studied him carefully, her sharp eyes searching his. It won't be easy, Samuel, she said finally. You're not married. You have no prior experience as a father. And, she hesitated. Your past with Lillian, if it comes up in court, they might use it against you. Samuel swallowed hard. He knew that. And yet. I don't care, he said firmly. She's not going with that man. I'll do whatever it takes. Sister Abigail exhaled. Then you need a lawyer. Immediately. Samuel nodded. I know someone. Samantha perked up. Does that mean I get to stay with you? Samuel's heart clenched. Yes, he whispered. I promise. An unexpected ally. Samuel wasted no time. The moment he left the orphanage, he drove straight to an office on the east side of town, a place he hadn't visited in years. He stepped inside, his stomach tight with nerves. A woman in a sleek navy blue blazer sat behind a desk, flipping through documents. She was tall, elegant, and carried an air of authority that made even the most confident men hesitate. Eleanor Carter. One of the best family lawyers in the city. And his former fiancé. The moment she looked up and saw him, her expression turned ice cold. Well, she said, setting down her pen. This is a surprise. Samuel exhaled. Eleanor, I need your help. She raised a brow. That's funny. Because the last time I saw you, you didn't need anyone. Samuel clenched his jaw. It's not about me. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. Oh? Then what is it about? Samuel hesitated. Then, softly, he said, a little girl. My daughter's child. For the first time, Eleanor's expression faltered. She studied him, searching his face. Lillian's daughter? Samuel nodded. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. Then, she sighed. Tell me everything. The truth comes out. By the time Samuel finished explaining, Eleanor's demeanor had changed. She wasn't just listening now, she was invested. You're telling me Gregory Russell just showed up, demanding custody? She asked. Yes, Samuel said. And he'll use every legal loophole to take her. Eleanor leaned forward, tapping a finger against her desk. Then we'll have to move fast. Samuel blinked. You'll help? She narrowed her eyes. I may not like you, Samuel, but that little girl? She's not going to end up with that man. Samuel exhaled, relief flooding through him. Thank you. Eleanor stood. First things first, we file for emergency guardianship. That will buy us time before he can make a move in court. Samuel nodded. And after that? Eleanor crossed her arms. Then, we prepare for battle. Gregory's next move. That night, Samuel barely slept. He stayed by Samantha's side, listening to her soft breathing, watching over her like a guardian angel afraid to blink. But his restlessness wasn't unwarranted. Because the next morning, Gregory Russell struck. A loud knock thundered through the orphanage doors. Sister Abigail opened it, and immediately tensed. Two uniformed officers stood outside. And behind them? Gregory. With a smug smile on his face. I'd like to report a case of kidnapping, he announced. Sister Abigail's breath hitched. You can't be serious. Gregory smirked. Oh, I am. That man, he pointed a finger at Samuel, illegally removed my granddaughter from this orphanage. I have the right to press charges. The officers turned to Samuel. Sir, is that true? One of them asked. Samuel stood his ground. No, he said firmly. I'm filing for legal guardianship. Gregory chuckled. Oh, I know. That's why I decided to get ahead of you. He pulled out a document, and Samuel's heart stopped. It was a court summons. Gregory had filed an emergency custody petition. The officers exchanged glances. Sir, until this matter is settled, the child needs to remain in legal custody. Samuel's pulse pounded. No. No, no, no. Gregory smirked. Say goodbye to your little pet project, Reverend. Samantha grabbed Samuel's hand, tears welling in her eyes. No. I don't want to go with him. Samuel dropped to his knees, gripping her shoulders. Listen to me, sweetheart. His voice shook. I won't let him take you. I swear. Samantha sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. Please don't leave me. Samuel's throat closed. A flash of memory hit him, Lillian, crying on the day he left her. Never again. He stood up, turning to the officers. This man is dangerous. He's manipulating the law to take a child he doesn't care about. Gregory laughed. You sound desperate, Reverend. Samuel's fists clenched. Sister Abigail stepped forward. You're making a mistake, she told the officers. That man is not fit to raise a child. One of the officers hesitated, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. I'd like to see the paperwork. Everyone turned. Eleanor Carter stood in the doorway, her briefcase in hand, her gaze sharp as a blade. Gregory's smugness flickered. Who the hell are you? Eleanor smirked. His lawyer. The room fell silent. Then, in a calm, lethal voice, she added. And trust me, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. The courtroom war begins. The air in the orphanage was thick with tension. Gregory Russell's smug grin faltered as Eleanor Carter stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. I assume you have a problem, Miss Carter? Gregory sneered. Eleanor tilted her head, giving him a look that could cut glass. Oh, I have several. Let's start with the fact that you filed for emergency custody without due process. That alone is grounds for dismissal. Gregory scoffed. I have the legal right. You have nothing, Eleanor snapped. She turned to the officers. Did you even verify this man's background before escorting him here? The officers exchanged a look. He's the child's biological grandfather, one said hesitantly. Eleanor smirked. And also a man with multiple financial fraud accusations in the last 10 years. A man who left his own daughter to fend for herself and showed zero interest in his granddaughter until she was convenient for him. Gregory's face darkened. That's true, Eleanor interrupted smoothly. And I have evidence. She pulled out a thick folder and handed it to the lead officer. I'd suggest you review this before allowing a child to be handed over to a man with questionable ethics. Gregory's expression turned murderous. You think you're smart, don't you? Eleanor gave him a lazy smile. Oh, I don't think. I know. Gregory's jaw clenched. He turned back to the officers. I still have legal grounds to pursue custody. One of the officers sighed. That may be true, but until a court decides, we can't remove the child. He turned to Eleanor. You'll need to present this in family court. Eleanor nodded. We will. Gregory's eyes flickered with something dark. Then I'll see you there. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Samuel finally exhaled. His hands were still shaking, his pulse a hammer in his chest. Eleanor turned to him. You owe me dinner for that. Samuel let out a breathless chuckle. I'll buy you the whole damn restaurant. Samantha tugged on his sleeve. What happens now? Eleanor knelt, looking her in the eyes. Now, sweetheart, we fight. Preparing for war. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Eleanor worked like a woman possessed. Samuel barely had time to sleep between gathering character witnesses, preparing statements, and answering every legal challenge Gregory threw their way. And he threw a lot. He claimed Samuel was unfit to raise a child. He accused him of being an absentee father, bringing up his past with Lillian. He even tried to bribe officials to expedite his custody request. But Eleanor countered everything. We'll bury him in legal technicalities, she told Samuel. Gregory is powerful, but he's sloppy. We just need to prove he's not fit to be a guardian. Samuel hesitated. What if we fail? Eleanor's eyes softened. Then we don't. Failure is not an option. The courtroom showdown. 2 days later, Samuel sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, his hands clenched into fists. Gregory Russell sat across from him, looking composed, confident, even bored. But Samuel noticed something else. There was no warmth in his gaze. No love. Gregory didn't want Samantha. He wanted control. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. This hearing is to determine the custody of Samantha Russell, the judge announced. The petitioner, Mr. Gregory Russell, claims biological rights. The respondent, Mr. Samuel Carter, seeks guardianship. Both parties may present their case. Gregory's lawyer, a thin, gray-haired man, stood first. Your Honor, my client is the rightful biological guardian of the child. He is wealthy, well-established, and can provide Samantha with a life of luxury. Samuel clenched his jaw. Eleanor whispered, "Wait for it." Gregory's lawyer continued. Mr. Carter, on the other hand, has no legal claim. He was not present for Lillian Russell's life. He has no parental rights and no history of raising children. Samuel's stomach twisted. That part was true. The lawyer turned, eyes cold. Simply put, Your Honor, my client is the only responsible choice. Silence. Then, Eleanor stood. Your Honor, my client may not have been in Samantha's life from the beginning, but neither was Mr. Russell. In fact, she strode forward, placing a file on the judge's desk. This man has a history of abandoning his own children. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor turned to Gregory. Tell me, Mr. Russell, where were you when your daughter was homeless at 18? Gregory's face remained impassive. Irrelevant. Eleanor smirked. Not to the child you abandoned. The judge frowned. Ms. Carter, do you have proof of neglect? Eleanor nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Testimonies from Lillian's former neighbors, employers, and even an old child support case he never paid. The judge's eyebrows lifted. Gregory's lawyer fumbled for a response, but Eleanor wasn't done. She turned to Samuel. Mr. Carter, would you say you love Samantha? Samuel swallowed hard. More than anything. Eleanor nodded. Then tell us why. Samuel exhaled slowly, looking at the judge. I never knew about Lillian until it was too late, he admitted. That's a regret I'll carry forever. But Samantha, she's my second chance. A chance to make things right. To love her the way her mother deserved to be loved. His voice broke. She's not just my responsibility. She's my family. A hush fell over the room. The judge studied Samuel for a long moment. Then, he turned to Gregory. Mr. Russell, do you have anything to say? Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. I can provide wealth. Stability. The judge raised a brow. And love? Gregory hesitated, just 1 second too long. The judge exhaled. I've heard enough. Samuel held his breath. Legal guardianship of Samantha Russell is granted to Samuel Carter. The room erupted. Samuel sagged in his chair, tears burning his eyes as Samantha flung herself into his arms. Gregory stood abruptly, fuming. This isn't over, he hissed. Eleanor smirked. Yes, it is. Gregory stormed out, his last failed attempt at control fading into silence. And Samuel? For the first time in years, he felt something new. Peace. Samantha buried her face in his shoulder. You kept your promise. Samuel closed his eyes. Yes, sweetheart. He held her tight. I did. A new beginning or a new threat? The courtroom victory should have been the end of Samuel's troubles. But something didn't sit right. Gregory Russell wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat. And Samuel knew that all too well. Home, sweet home. After weeks of uncertainty, Samantha finally moved into Samuel's home, a cozy, well-kept townhouse with a small garden in the back. She was quiet at first, hesitant, as if she expected everything to be temporary. Samuel couldn't blame her. She had been tossed around so much in her young life. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, he watched as she poked at her mashed potatoes. "You don't like them?" he asked. She shrugged. "I do." Samuel frowned. "Then what's wrong?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I just don't want to get used to this. What if he takes me away?" Samuel's chest tightened. He put his fork down and leaned forward. "That's not going to happen. I promise." She looked up, eyes filled with doubt. "Mom used to say that about other things. And they still happened." Samuel exhaled. She had lost so much trust in the world. And now, it was up to him to rebuild it. That night, after she fell asleep, Samuel called Eleanor. "She's still scared," he admitted. "She doesn't believe this is real." Eleanor sighed. "That's normal. Trauma like that doesn't disappear overnight. I don't want her to feel unsafe." "Then make sure she doesn't," Eleanor said firmly. "Show her, every day, that she's home. That she's yours." "Actions, Samuel. Not words." Samuel nodded. "Right." And so, that's exactly what he did. A father's love. Every morning, he made her breakfast, even if it was just toast and scrambled eggs. He showed up for every school event, even the small ones. He gave her space when she needed it but was always there when she was ready. And slowly, the walls she had built began to crumble. One day, Samantha came home from school, threw her backpack on the couch, and said, "Hey, Dad, can I go to the park with my friends?" Samuel froze. Not because of the request, but because of what she had called him. Dad. She hadn't even realized it. But Samuel had. And in that moment, he knew. He had truly become her father. Gregory's shadow. But just when life started to feel normal, the shadows returned. One evening, Samuel arrived home late from work. As he stepped onto his porch, he noticed something odd. A black luxury car parked across the street. The engine was running. The windows were tinted. And the moment he looked in its direction, the car sped away. Samuel's stomach twisted. His mind immediately went to Gregory. Was he watching them? Planning something? Samuel grabbed his phone and called Eleanor. "There was a car outside my house," he said, his voice low. "Luxury, black, tinted windows." She cursed under her breath. "Did you get a plate number?" "No. But it felt off." Eleanor sighed. "I wouldn't put it past Gregory to try something. He's powerful, Samuel. And men like him? They don't accept losses easily. What do we do?" "I'll look into it. But in the meantime, keep your guard up." Samuel clenched his jaw. Always. An unexpected encounter. A week passed. Samuel tried to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was coming. But then, it happened. One evening, as he and Samantha walked out of a small bookstore, a man approached. He was tall, dressed in a sleek, black suit, his hair perfectly combed back. Samuel immediately recognized him. One of Gregory's men. The man gave a tight smile. "Mr. Carter." Samuel moved slightly, positioning himself in front of Samantha. "What do you want?" The man's smile didn't waver. "Just a message." Samuel's hands curled into fists. "Then say it." The man stepped closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "Gregory Russell doesn't lose." Samuel's jaw tightened. He's done, and he knows it, Samuel said through gritted teeth. Tell him to stay away from my daughter. The man chuckled. She's his granddaughter. That makes her his family. You? You're just an outsider. Samuel took a deep breath. Get out of my way. The man held up his hands in mock surrender. Of course. Just remember, Gregory always gets what he wants. With that, he turned and disappeared into the night. Samuel's heart pounded. He looked down at Samantha. She was gripping his hand tightly. She had heard everything. I'm not going anywhere, he told her firmly. She didn't say anything. But she held on to his hand the whole way home. A war not yet over. Samuel sat in his living room that night, staring at the legal documents Eleanor had prepared. He had one custody. Legally, Samantha was his. But in the world of men like Gregory Russell, the law didn't mean much. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. And Samuel wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever.